This video is all about contextualisation. Big word indeed. Let's find out what it means, because it is an important concept for those of us who work in the vet industry. Vocational education and training, remember, not small animals. Okay, so firstly, assessment context and conditions. Let's talk about that. What is the assessment context? Well, the context and the conditions of assessment clarify the target group and the purpose of the tool, and is recorded in the instructions for the assessor, the learner, and any contributing third party. So what does that mean? That's a lot of words. Well, basically, I tend to break down the word context into situation. Context means situation. So the context, which is the situation of the assessment and the conditions of the assessment, they help us clarify what the assessment needs to look like. When we're trying to work out how we're going to assess some people, we need to think, who are these people? Who is this target group? What's the purpose of what we're trying to achieve? And we need to record that information as well. So the way that we're going to assess different people will be different. And that depends upon the situation. It depends upon the context. It's about the adapting the way we do things to make it better for a specific group of people that we're going to be assessing. So here's our candidates, and they're excited. Woohoo! And they're excited because the instructions that we create should be appropriate for them. They should be appropriate for the reader and can be included with the assessment instrument or attached as a separate document. We need to have those instructions for the learners written down. And not just the instructions for the learners, but also the instructions for the assessors as well. By looking at the context, you can consider the conditions under which the evidence for assessment must be gathered. So again, it's about looking at the situation, it's about looking at the context, it's about asking ourselves, who are we going to be assessing, and therefore helping us to determine relevant evidence and how that evidence is going to be gathered. What are the assessment instruments going to look like? This slide then introduces us to information about the assessment conditions. In fact, the training package requirements and the industry consultation may identify conditions that need to be considered when conducting assessments. And these assessment conditions can be written there in the units of competency. So we need to consider the assessment conditions when we're reviewing the assessment, when we're reviewing the training package, when we're looking at the unit of competency, when we're preparing our assessment plans. It might include things like the equipment or material requirements. We might get guidance about that. It could be contingencies. It could be specifications. It could be specific information that needs to be considered when we're putting together our assessment instruments. It could be the physical conditions. It could be the relationships with other team members. It could be our relationships with clients and customers. We consider all of these things as part of the contextualisation process, and some of that information may be looking at us in the assessment conditions within a unit of competency. Also, finally, very importantly, the time frames for completion. And this is something that's just starting to creep in over the last couple of years into training packages, into units of competency. Are there specific time frames or specific amounts in terms of the number of assessments that need to be conducted? Now, here's an example for us, looking at an extract from the unit of competency CHCECE 003, Provide Care for Children, and it has this specific information in it regarding the assessment context, the assessment conditions. Firstly, it tells us that the assessment skills must be demonstrated in a regulated education and care service. So it needs to be a regulated provider. It needs to be a serious childcare centre that's operating within the regulations. In addition to that, there's situations relating to emergency or unplanned procedures that need to be considered. This is part of contingencies. So not only can we just assess the stock standard situation, but we need to assess emergencies or unplanned procedures as well, because that's the important stuff of what happens in childcare centres, is often the emergency things. That's where the rubber meets the road. Also, we need to consider relevant equipment and resources for that working environment. We can't just simulate everything. We need to have the equipment on tap that would actually be used within that environment. And finally, we need to make use of the National Quality Framework. So the assessments need to consider that National Quality Framework. Taking all this into account, there's a lot of information on that screen in terms of how we're going to need to frame and organise our assessments. Without that information, without those assessment conditions, we might come up with very different solutions as to how we're going to contextualise our assessments. So looking at the assessment conditions is very important within a unit of competency. Generally, as a refresher, contextualisation means that the assessment suits the needs of the candidates and the environments in which they wish to perform their competence. We need to be aware of the candidates, who they are, what they're trying to achieve, so that we can contextualise the assessments most effectively. Additionally, it also involves providing options for candidates who are not suited to the preferred method of assessment. So if we're planning ahead, we might see some options whereby we'll be able to make some changes for some candidates who won't fit the stock standard regular expectations of what we're expecting in that group. And we can plan for that in advance. Contextualisation is a big topic, it's an important topic, and it's something that experienced trainers and assessors get very good at. When we're first getting started, we've got a lot going on, and I can understand it might be a little difficult to think, can I wrap my head around all this? Over experience and over time, you will.